This is Whitehall Sources. Thank you for being with us today. Feel free to email anytime. The inbox is always open, and the email address is hello@whitehallsources.com. If you want to have your say on the budget, how it affects you, if you're excited or indeed particularly scared about what you have heard today, and as our analysis continues, then you can get in touch. hello@whitehallsources.com. Follow the podcast, subscribe to the podcast. We're here every Thursday, and we love being with you. So if you follow and subscribe, you will never miss an episode ever again. Now, as mentioned, this is a special episode. It is a guest fest. And it's great to welcome Simon Jones to the podcast. Good afternoon, Simon.
Hi there.
Hi, good to have you with us. So Simon was a special advisor in the Department for Transport, also in the business unit under Theresa May and Boris Johnson. A glutton for punishment, Simon, I think it's fair to say. First of all, just a broad take on the budget from today, I suppose, your overarching thought.
Just that I think a very difficult outlook for the economy. It's a global economy. It's sort of in that triangulation between the difficulties of China and trying to get trade out of China at the moment with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then emerging out of COVID. The options for Jeremy Hunt were very limited indeed. But I've got to say, slightly more optimistic that he's been able to make prioritization really on those who can least afford it. Yes, there are tax rises, and quite substantial tax rises if you're an energy firm or if you're a higher earner. But let's not kid ourselves. Things are going to be tough over the next few years, especially for everybody.
Does it feel for you, Simon, does it feel very different to previous budgets and autumn statements and whatnot? You know, when you were in there, when you were working in your various departments and whatnot, does this contrast in your mind when you think back?
I think this is probably the most difficult budget. I often wonder whether they all seem difficult at the time, but you've got to say it's particularly mind-blowingly difficult for the options that are available. And I can remember being in Downing Street, where you'd get lots of representations from business organisations in advance of the autumn statement. People would put forward their ideas. You'd be looking through them. You'd be saying, this is a good way of spending money. This is not the time where money is available, and therefore the choices are so difficult for the Chancellor. And if you were sitting in DfT, as I did for 3 years, looking at what was coming down the line and those awkward conversations you'd have in meetings with the Chancellor's special advisors and sit in with the Chancellor and your Secretary of State while negotiations were happening, you'd know that inflation is your killer. And inflation this time round is so difficult because 10% of your budget and your working budget disappearing overnight just on inflation will make some spending decisions that have not been identified today really difficult in the coming weeks and months when they become more apparent. Don't get me wrong, really welcome the infrastructure certainty, and I'm sure a lot of businesses will, but that won't mean that there are easy decisions to make within departments going forward.
Yeah, really interesting actually. Let's consider, I suppose, some of the specifics then and some of your expertise, particularly. First of all, Northern Powerhouse Rail and HS2 high-speed rail projects going to go ahead. Jeremy Hunt saying more than £600 billion will be invested over the next 5 years to connect our country and grow our economy. Did he realistically have any choice when it comes to making transport better?
It's a fair point. Did he have a choice? I suppose he did. There's a lot of calls from the backbenches, and they certainly existed in my time in DfT, where you'd have all sorts of representation saying, don't do these big grandiose schemes. They take multiple electoral cycles to go and build. You've only just seen in recent weeks the finally Crossrail or Elizabeth Line opening in London. The people that are knocking on the door wanting Northern Powerhouse Rail, they don't want it in 30 years' time when it might be completed. They want it next week. It isn't going to be delivered next week. It's going to be delivered in 30 years' time in its totality. They don't want necessarily high-speed rail in the north. They want services to stop near their homes and take them to the jobs in their cities. So it's these decisions are not easy to make. They are the right decisions to make. I don't think there's a disagreement from the Labour Party or the Conservative Party in connecting our cities and making sure that you level up. If you want to really level up economies, you've got to make some of the major cities in the north of the UK more connectable. And that has to be done. If you wanted to make things easy, you wanted to do things very quickly, then maybe you just need to have more buses, because at least you could deliver those by within the election time frame. But the thought of just being able to go on a bus from Sheffield to Manchester isn't probably as exciting as it would be on fantastic new infrastructure, which the government have committed to today.
I think for me, when it comes to infrastructure and when it comes to rail, Northern Powerhouse Rail, HS2, these are yet more examples where politics becomes very personal to people, because these are things that people want to use, ideally every day or frequently if they're commuting or travelling or whatever. And it falls into almost a similar bracket for me as energy prices, for example, where suddenly politics becomes very personal to lots of people because it's right on your doorstep. In terms of strategising around that, Simon, is that, it's an election winner, surely, to say, as you kind of alluded to, that actually we want to make transport better. So it's good politics. But is it weird to consider that £600 billion is going to be invested at a time when everyone is actually facing a real squeeze on spending? Is it difficult to convey that message, I suppose, is what I'm getting at?
I think it's exceptionally difficult to convey the message, and also the £600 billion isn't spent in a single year. It's spent over a long period of time. High Speed 2, if you have done like I've done, taken journeys on the West Coast main line at the moment, you can see the big construction sites. It's very exciting. And it shows that something is coming along. But let's be honest, we're not going to be on a high-speed train to Birmingham Curzon Street for many more years to come. And if for those that are anoraks in infrastructure, as I am, I've been waiting for Crossrail to open for a long period of time. It was 4 years late. Dare I say it, as a Spurs fan, I was waiting for the Tottenham Stadium to open for 18 months longer than I was expecting as well, because new infrastructure is amazing, but it's also really complex and it's very costly, but it's worth getting these things right. I mean, for those that question High Speed 2, I would say the one thing I do question about it is its name. It's not high, it's not in the air, it's not about speed, it's about capacity, and it's certainly not the second, because we didn't have a first. So it's a very weird project. But if you said to people, do you think the Romans got it right by building the roads and spending the money on the infrastructure, you'd probably say yes, because you're still using most of them today, a thousand years or a couple of thousand years later. So we do need to spend money on infrastructure in this country. We do need to spend it right the way across. I'd say the Midlands probably lacks the infrastructure spending as much as the North, and I'm sure I can already hear the voices of your listeners saying, well, what about the Southwest as well? And it's true, we need to spend a lot of money on infrastructure if we want to travel around this country, and not least in a more environmentally and sustainable way.
Yeah. I mean, High Speed 2 is an interesting one, isn't it? It's not just about the capacity on the rail, although the pandemic seems to have solved our capacity on rail problem in ways that we hadn't foreseen, and not terribly helpful for the network. But it's the regeneration that comes around it. I was always quite sceptical when I was a journalist about High Speed 2, and then I went to Manchester, and you go to Birmingham, and you see the investment that years out from the project actually coming to fruition, the investment that comes into cities as a consequence of knowing that you've got that kind of big anchor project coming in. I appreciate that Esther McVeigh's not a fan of High Speed 2, and she's threatened to vote against the finance bill as a consequence of it. That would have been awkward if she had ended up as Jeremy Hunt's deputy and he'd been leader. But actually, I think what really convinced me is precisely this kind of levelling up point. It's not just the rail project, it is all the investment that comes with it. But Simon, I wanted to ask you, so the capital investment is one part of the story. The supply side reform is the second part of that. What for you was in or wasn't in this statement about the reforms that we need to see to get Britain building again?
I think, sorry, just on one of your points you made there, because I thought it was fascinating. There are more train journeys being made today on some routes than there were before the pandemic. They're not making as much money because they're no longer the very expensive routes first thing in the peak fares. So things are back. Supply, look, the reforms that are missing is, look, we're going to need to build more homes in this country. There was very little on building new homes today, and that's going to be vital if we want to take people out of poverty as well. Housing is still exceptionally expensive, even after a downturn, dare I say, and even if those of us who own homes, we're going to see the value go down over the next couple of years, I suspect. So that's what the analysts say. Things are going to be very difficult. I'd like to see more investment going into SMEs to help them through to become more productive. I don't think there was a great focus today on productivity, something which we know that has to happen. And many times, this country is a country of small businesses, and those small businesses are not necessarily as effective at being able to access the support they need to become more productive, to sell abroad, to take the next person, employ the next person. There's still a lot to be done. There is still a lot to be done about immigration into this country as well, because we need it. Let's be perfectly blunt, and I think the country now appreciates that it does need to be an open democracy.
Simon, it's so good to have you on. Thank you very much. Thanks for your expertise. By the way, one question I'm asking everyone, because we've got so many of you on today, former advisors. Do you miss it? Do you miss not being there on a day like today?
On a day like today, I think you do miss it. You got to secretly say that, but you also don't miss the deluge of work. And actually, while you're watching all the theatre of the Chancellor standing up and making his speech, you realise that you never actually had the time to watch anything like that because you were too busy working out the next crisis. So I sort of feel sorry for my friends that are still in it. I have a bit of a survivor's guilt, but it was a totally amazing opportunity. But I'm glad to be working in the real world and helping companies now understand the complexities of politics and being able to fight their corner as well.
Yeah, and indeed helping us. Simon, thank you very much. Thanks for taking the time.
You're very welcome.